Hey everyone, Cody Hayes here, and I'd like to welcome you to this lecture. We are looking at another of the undisputed letters of Paul. In this case, we're looking at the letter to the Galatians, which some historians, though they are in the minority, think Paul wrote first and would make it the oldest work of the canonical New Testament. But those individuals are in the minority. But Galatians does really show a lot of the heart of what would be a major point in Pauline theology. So look a little bit at the date and the audience. Galatians, it was written around the years of 49 to 55 CE/AD, sometime after First Thessalonians, or at least most would say. A minority, though, would place Galatians before First Thessalonians. So, as mentioned previously, the majority of historians hold that First Thessalonians was written first. But there's a minority that argue for Galatians. Of course, Galatians has more of the heart of Pauline theology. First Thessalonians does not. But again, it's kind of like, the order of the books of the canonical gospels, which one was written first. And the reason why the majority of historians hold that Mark was written first is because Mark has the lowest Christology. And in the case with First Thessalonians versus Galatians, Galatians has a higher Pauline theology. And the audience for Galatians was a Gentile Christian audience. And that's pretty clear very early on because a major theme in the letter to the Galatians is telling the Gentile Christians, don't submit to circumcision because if you do, you're going to be obligated to follow the entire Torah, which you can't do. So, kind of beginning here with the thesis, the Judaizers, as Paul calls them, and then a little of Peter versus Paul. And so have here an image on the screen of law and grace. And then at the bottom, we have an image of Peter and Paul where sometimes Peter and Paul, even though they are the co-founders of the Roman See, the Roman diocese, they didn't always get along with one another. The main point behind the letter to the Galatians is that the death of Christ does away with the Jewish Torah/law. So that's the main thesis, the main point behind this letter. And it's really a core of Paul's theology that the death of Christ does away with the Torah and all the commandments associated with it. And another point that he mentions is how if another person, even an angel from heaven, is declaring another gospel or message from the one that I gave to you, let that person or being be anathematized. Paul is being pretty bold here when he uses an angel from heaven, that even if an angel from heaven came down and declared that you have to follow a different gospel from the one I'm preaching. Well, what actually would be that different gospel from the one that he's preaching? Well, it would be the one that would involve the individuals that he refers to as the Judaizers, who would have been the adoptionists/Ebionites. They were the individuals that held that while the death of Christ did away with, the sacrificial, the sin offerings of the Torah, other elements of the Torah, such as circumcision and the dietary laws, needed to be maintained. And Paul essentially says that if somebody, even an angel from heaven, comes to you and says that you have to do that, that you have to be circumcised in order to be in the covenant with the God of Abraham, that that person has been separated from the fold, which is what the word anathemized refers to, basically a state of excommunication, the person's cursed, etc., etc. And talks about how he opposed Peter, or Cephas, which is the transliteration of Kepha, or rock. The word Peter is the masculine form of the word rock in Greek. But anyway, that Paul opposed Peter, Cephas, to his face because of his actions at Antioch. So, what exactly happened here? Well, as Paul records, Peter, Cephas, was sitting down with Gentiles, non Jews, and he was eating with them. But when James arrived, James, Jesus' brother slash kinsman, who was arguably sympathetic to a lot of the rituals of the Torah, when he arrived, Peter started to move away and wasn't associating with the Gentiles, and now is only associating with his Jewish brethren. And Paul got on to him for doing this and said, "You're in the wrong with how you're acting." Now, we don't know how Peter felt about this. For all we know, Peter may have responded back, "You know what, Paul, you're out of line here. You're the one who's out of line." We don't know that. Paul obviously isn't going to record that. But it is interesting that when Paul writes his letter to the Romans, he doesn't mention Peter by name, though he does imply him with a reference about how another person built the foundation there, the groundwork. Does imply Peter, but doesn't mention him by name. And a lot of that may have had to do with what took place at Antioch. But mentioning the Torah, or the law, Paul mentions how no one can fulfill the Torah. No one can fulfill the law. The law is a curse. A Jewish person would certainly have something to say about this. But regardless of which, this is an attitude that Paul also shows in the letter to the Romans, how no one can fulfill the law. It's impossible. And, he tells his children in Galatia that, if you accept circumcision, you're going to be subjected to the entire law to fulfill the entire law, and it's a curse. You're cursed if you do so. And then he also mentions how the law was ordained through angels. And I'm going to have a quick sip of water before I comment on this point. What Paul is getting at is the giving of the Torah, the law, to Moses, which is referenced in chapter 33 of Deuteronomy. In our earliest Hebrew manuscripts, there are no angels referenced with giving the law to Moses. However, in the Greek, in the Septuagint, there is a reference to angels. Essentially, what Paul is trying to do here is weaken the effect of the Torah by stating how it was ordained through angels. Now, I think that such an argument would be subjected to interpretation, but that's where Paul is trying to go, to try and weaken the effect of the Torah, the law. Because, again, as I've mentioned before, For the Jewish people, the big thing is the Torah, the law. I talked about, in a previous lecture, how I don't see as much of this apparel anymore, but I remember how Christians, used to have apparel with the initials WWJD, what would Jesus do? And the Jewish people making, a counter to that had apparel with the initials WDTS. What does Torah say? So, again, Paul is trying to weaken, the big element within Judaism, the Torah, the law, Genesis through Deuteronomy, and the 613 commandments that are part of the Torah. Well, that's essentially it for the letter to the Galatians. So if you do have any questions, please feel free to send me an email. Till then, take care